From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Chung, and this matters. Few elections are ever decided on a single issue, but bank on this. Millions of Canadians are heading to the ballot box with money in mind. The cost of living is at a critical point across Canada. Inflation hit the highest annual increase in a decade this summer. The housing market remains red hot, relentlessly competitive with sky-high prices. Many young and middle-class Canadians feel it's an impossibility to ever own a home. Then there's childcare, which can cost thousands of dollars a month in big cities. Everywhere, it seems, Canadians are getting squeezed for every dollar. And every party leader says they have the plan to fix it. The fiscal policies that will solve a problem decades in the making. But behind the numbers, what do their ideas really add up to? Joining This Matters, Heather Scoffield, the Toronto Star's Ottawa bureau chief and economics columnist. This episode is all about money in the election. We're talking affordability of housing, daycare, and everything else. Plus, we'll try to figure out the question everyone wants the answer to. What does an economic recovery from the pandemic look like anyway? Heather, thanks so much for joining the podcast. Great to have you here.
My pleasure.
You could make a pretty good argument that few election issues affect Canadians more intimately, more personally than their finances. This is about paying the bills and affordability, job opportunities. But then during the campaign, big numbers get thrown around. It can be confusing for people to wrap their heads around what that means in their lives. So how should voters approach or understand what the leaders are promising for fiscal policies?
It's a good question because there are certainly a lot of details. When I take a look at the platforms and the costing that they've done, it's line after line after line of boutique items meant to appeal to certain parts of the electorate. So what the heck do you do with all of that? I would say something really great is actually happening here. All of the main parties have put a lot of thought into affordability issues, into how to deal with housing, how to deal with jobs and wages, and generally the cost of living. These are serious proposals. There's nothing out there that's completely outrageous. And so I think voters can generally take a lot of heart in the fact that there are some serious proposals out there and that every party is thinking hard about key issues that, they've been around for years, were completely exacerbated by the pandemic, and now are quite urgent to resolve. So if you go into it thinking, okay, I have some pretty good choices at my fingertips here, I think voters then need to go to the next level and just say, okay, what really, really matters to me when I cast my vote? Is it housing? Is it daycare? Is it, the fiscal situation and the deficit over the long term? Is it long-term care? And then you've got to dig in and do your homework after that because it does get quite complex quite quickly.
Yeah, as you were saying there, there's a lot to talk about under that big umbrella of affordability, and we will get to that. But why do you think has affordability become such a big election issue, especially this time, and especially the leaders trying to make that more tangible for people?
I think we have to go back to 2019 for that, when in the last campaign. Our affordability was front and center then too. And, that election didn't really resolve issues. We talked a lot about housing costs in 2019 and there were measures put in place and the housing prices just kept going up. And then we got to the pandemic, which really changed the dynamic or amplified it, I would say. Those housing prices in particular went up and up and up during the pandemic, and not just in Toronto, not just in Montreal, not just in Vancouver, but we saw it in the suburbs and we saw it even further than that. It spread across the country, Ottawa, Gatineau, even into smaller towns. The pandemic has really changed that whole dynamic of where people live and the demand for housing. On top of that, there are a lot of people out there with extra cash to spend. But there's a flip side of that where a lot of people lost their jobs. There's a lot of insecurity about where the job market heads next, a lot of flux in the job market itself. Even if you have a job, will you be able to keep it? Is it moving online? Are we moving into a digital economy faster than you can keep up with your skills? So all that uncertainty is making people, I think, feel quite uncertain and, ill at ease about where they'll be heading next and how they're going to pay the bills over the long run.
Let's dive deeper into housing because I know, especially for many Canadians and young Canadians, it feels like an impossibility that they'll ever be able to buy a home. Leaders have been saying that is the gap in the middle class, that people can't build up their lives that way.
All of this throws up barriers to young families looking for more space for their kids. people who have found a good job and want to buy their first home, and retired empty nesters trying to downsize.
The three biggest parties, what do they say that they'll do to fix this crisis? Because it is at a crisis level now.
Yeah, it's at a crisis level for families that don't come from wealth, right? If you're coming from a wealthy family in Toronto, you're probably going to be okay. But if you're from outside of Toronto and you're young and you want to move to the big city and get a great job, well, you're going to have to work at that great job for quite a while before you can afford to buy a house, right? So, this is, as you say, very much a middle class issue. It's also an inequality issue. So, the Liberals and the Conservatives both say that the Conservatives want to build 1 million houses, the Liberals want to build 1.4 million houses. So that's on the supply side. I think it's really important to look at the supply side because this, at its heart, is a supply side issue. We have more people. The population is growing all the time. We have more people than we have houses. So how can you go about boosting the supply? The Liberals, they want to restore or replenish the housing supply and also make it easier to build houses. They're aiming at 1.4 million houses over 4 years. So that's higher than we would get naturally through the housing market. Conservatives have a 1 million over 3 years. They want to see 1 million houses built. They talk about selling off federal lands and giving incentives to construction companies and also to municipalities to get that happening. So that's on the supply side. The thing is that we know from experience, we've been grappling with this problem for a long time. We know that changing the supply of housing takes a long time. It takes a long time to build houses. It just does. Just the construction takes a while. It's not something you can snap your fingers and all of a sudden have 1 million houses, right? There are municipal rules in the way. There are, lots of different zoning regulations and so forth, and transit and all sorts of different patterns of living and demographics that play into that. So that takes a while. They've got some serious proposals out there to change the supply. But on the demand side, it's easier to change demand. And this is where we get into trouble in the election campaign. It's very tempting for the parties to want to say, I'm going to make it easier for you to buy a house. That's all demand side, and it fuels the market and it prices up over pretty quickly. So, okay, what are they doing on the demand side? The Liberals are talking about a rent to own program that would allow, certain first-time home buyers to, while they're renting, to actually start to build up equity in their houses. They're also talking about doubling the first-time home buyers credit. So, putting a lot more money and a lot more capacity in the hands of first-time home buyers to be able to make that first move. And they are talking about a 2-year ban on foreign money into housing that they wouldn't be living in. The Conservatives, they were the first out of the gate with that 2-year ban on foreign buyers. So they have that on the demand side. And they are also talking about making it easier to qualify for a mortgage and changing the structure of how you'd finance a house. So again, juicing up demand. The NDP, they talk a lot about affordable housing, but they are also talking about putting a tax on foreign buyers and also easing mortgage rules. So again, that would juice demand. And so those things you could do right away. It would make it easier to buy a house immediately. But as soon as those house prices start to move, then, it might end up being a wash.
So it's all well and good for parties to promise all of these millions of homes in terms of the supply, but you do have to break some of the patterns of behavior that has generated that demand to begin with, as you were saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a big piece missing from this whole conversation. These are serious policies that they're putting forward, but they are not talking about immigration, which is where our source of our population growth comes from. And, increasing immigration is a huge part of the country's strategy to grow the workforce and to boost economic growth. If we're inviting all these people into the country to live, where are they going to live if we don't have houses? It's not exactly an attractive offer if you're trying to attract highly skilled immigrants to Canada, and then you also have an extremely expensive housing market for them to move into. So there's an equation there that hasn't really been grappled with out front and center.
Why do you think that the parties haven't talked about that? Because listening to that debate, when they do talk about affordability, you don't hear the word immigration said one time.
It's true. I think it's a difficult conversation for them to have. It ends up being fraught and emotional, and it takes, I think, probably a lot of courage to go there, but I don't see evidence that they've thought it all through either. So it could also be that they just don't have the full answers there to that equation.
Is this the first time that you've seen affordability, and especially when it comes to housing, be something that everyone across the political spectrum appears to agree on? We're not even arguing so much whether or not that there is an issue. It seems like all the parties can agree on that point. Is this the first time you've seen that kind of discussion?
No, I think 2019 was also a lot about affordability, but the discussion in that campaign in 2019 was not nearly as meaningful. There were some people that had affordability issues in their lives. Daycare costs were rising. Housing was unaffordable for some people in some parts of the country. So it didn't quite resonate as much as it does now. And now it's really, affordability in 2019 was something that the parties could use to throw. It was like a bucket that they could throw all sorts of their favorite issues into and say, we're making life better for you. I would say that the issues around affordability have become far more urgent in this campaign.
We'll be right back. The second big issue in affordability is, of course, childcare. The Liberals and the Conservatives have very different ideas on what that should look like to keep costs for parents down. Can you explain how they differ there?
Yes, this is a huge differentiator between, the Liberals and the NDP are kind of in the same boat on one side, and then the Conservatives are taking a very different approach. They all agree that families need help with daycare and that providing daycare options is really important for families, not just affordability, but to get women into the workforce, which has been a problem during the pandemic. Their ways of approaching that are extremely different. So the Liberals put in their last budget, they put $30 billion over the long term into childcare and set about negotiating agreements with the provinces to take the cost of daycare down to $10 a day and to cut costs by 50% in the short term.
As part of the agreement, in the next 5 years, we'll work with the provincial government to achieve an average of $10 a day childcare for all regulated spaces for kids under 6.
And also boost the wages of daycare workers and to have a high quality, accessible daycare across the country. The NDP says that they have just come out with their platform a few days ago, and they say, yes, we want to do that too. And the difference between us and them is we will do it, and they will just talk about it. The Liberals respond to that, saying that, in fact, they have already negotiated some bilateral agreements with several provinces, including Quebec, and that they have shown that they are ready to make this actually a real thing. So the Conservatives come at it from a very different perspective. They would allow the first year of that money to flow, that $30 billion, but they would cancel the rest of it. So basically canceling about $26 billion, billion with a B, and would replace it with a tax credit for childcare costs. And that would cost about $2.6 billion over the 4 years, I believe. It's about a tenth of the cost of what the Liberals have put forward. They say that what they really want to do here is allow choice to families, to give them more leeway to how they would spend their daycare dollars. If they want to spend their household budget on having, home care or just to figure out, care on weekends or so forth, that they would not have to go through a state-run institution. So their pitch there is choice, and they would do it through the tax system, a very, very different approach.
So the Liberals and the NDP, again, are looking more at a system revamp of the whole thing. And the Conservatives are more saying, okay, we will give you the money in order for you to choose what you want. But essentially, we're going to keep most of the system the same as it is, more status quo.
Well, it's a serious tax credit that they're talking about.
Mm-hmm, yes. A lot of money. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And it's not direct cash. It's based on, okay, if you pay out a bunch, then you get some back in a tax rebate. And it's very much skewed towards low income. So if you're a low income family and childcare is taking up a huge chunk of your household budget, you would end up getting quite a bit back from the government in the end.
Could you see childcare costs being a pretty big deal, especially in major cities, urban ridings, where in Toronto, for instance, we see that the median cost per month is nearly $1,600 for childcare. Could you see that being a key voting issue in major cities?
That's an interesting question because, to me, on the surface of it, I would say, of course, but it does not seem to be the case. I've just done a bit of traveling across the country, talking to people about, how the pandemic has affected them and what they're looking for in their federal leaders. Childcare does not come up immediately. It comes up when I ask them. I'm interested in the subject, so I ask, but it doesn't come up generically. And it's the same thing with the candidates. So I looked into some polling around that just to figure out what on earth is going on there. There's such a stark difference between how the Liberals would handle it and the Conservatives would handle it. I thought for sure it would be a vote driver. But, some of the polling that I saw had childcare down there as 4th or 5th in ranking in terms of how people would cast their votes. And the reason I think it might be is because childcare is extremely important and it puts a very big hole in your household budget for a few years, right? And, if you're not in that age group and your children aren't in that age group, then maybe it's not as much of a pocketbook issue for each individual. However, there is a broader issue at stake here. It's not just individuals and how they pay to take care of their kids. It's also, there's society-wide issues at stake here. There's a fiscal issue, obviously, $30 billion versus $2.6 billion makes a huge difference in the deficit. But also it makes a lot of difference in terms of how women get into the workforce and how you're able to recover and get out of the pandemic recession. There are a lot of companies complaining about shortage of workers these days. And where do they find those people? Well, if they're not able to have proper childcare or affordable childcare, they're going to have trouble getting into the workforce. So there's a fix there that goes beyond just taking care of the kids. It also speaks to the sustainability of the workforce.
Yeah, there is a societal gap here that the pandemic has, like many things, has exposed. Yeah.
Exactly.
Shifting gears here to talk about the recovery, there are many Canadians that really aren't all that jazzed to be heading to the polls during the pandemic. But the way that this election has been framed has often been around this question of who do you want leading the country out of the pandemic? How have the party leaders, have you seen, sold their vision of what that looks like?
Yeah, it's an interesting dichotomy in the way they pitch things, because I heard this repeatedly when I was traveling the country just last week. People are just so sick and tired of the pandemic and just are really searching for somebody who will say, it's over, let's get on with it. So, there are two approaches to that the parties are taking. There's the immediate term of vaccines, and just, obviously vaccines are the main tool that policymakers have to get out of the pandemic. And then there's the longer term recovery. What do you want to do with the economy and with society once we actually manage to get COVID under control? So, there's also a debate between, is the Canadian public so sick and tired of this thing they just want out regardless? Do they just want their old lives back, or do they want to build back better, as the Liberals would say? Do you take this kind of breaking point in how we've been in the socioeconomic development and how we've been, trundling along and try to turn it into something different? So the thing is, I'd say both the Conservative and the Liberal leaders are talking about, they want to give people a sense of security and continuity because we crave that in our lives. But they also want to present change because otherwise, what's the point of having an election campaign? They're trying to do both at the same time. So, okay, the Liberals have, they talk about vaccines and making it mandatory to have vaccines if you're traveling, and really pushing hard for everybody to get vaccinated. The Conservatives are pushing a voluntary approach more so than a mandatory approach. And, that's definitely a schism between the two parties. Going forward over the long-term recovery plans, they're both presenting a package, right? So the Liberals talk about climate change a lot, and that's certainly a big division between how the emphasis, I would say, between the Liberals and the Conservatives. The Liberals are also talking about, childcare is a big part of that. And they have not, over the long term, said that they would eliminate the deficit, for example, that building back better, investing in the future, pushing the economy towards a digital economy and more competitive and so forth, that's more important at this point. The Conservatives do talk about eliminating the deficit over the long term, over 10 years. But 10 years is a very long time in fiscal policy. They haven't shown exactly how they would ratchet it down and not spend extra money over the years on whatever it is. We're talking several mandates here. So they talk about that as an aspirational target, I would say. But they are very emphasizing, security. That's the buzzword that Aaron O'Toole has for his 5-point plan for economic recovery. And they talk about mainly tax measures. Nobody's talking about cutting any programs, though. They are pretty sensitive, I think, to the fact that the population is kind of bruised and battered after a pandemic and really not in the mood to have anybody tighten their belts.
Yeah, that is interesting in terms of a political debate, is that we're not hearing so much about cuts. And perhaps, many Canadians can see that just right now in this moment that spending has perhaps kept people afloat. Is that fair to say that that's the mood of the country right now?
Yeah, I would say so. And the Conservatives are a little bit compromised on this because, they like to paint themselves as the party of fiscal responsibility. And sometimes they go out and campaign on the fact that Trudeau has driven up the deficit to heights that the deficit is just way too fat for us to handle. But the thing is, they voted for that too, right? In March of 2020, when we were locking everything down and had no idea how COVID-19 was going to affect us, the federal government rolled out hundreds of billions of dollars in wage subsidies and income supports.
We'll also be expanding the Canada Emergency Response Benefit to reach people who are earning some income, as well as for seasonal workers who are facing no jobs, and for those who've run out of EI recently.
And it kept going and going, right? And these supports were supported by all the parties in the House of Commons. They were rolled out with collaboration, and there was a little bit of back and forth about how to design the things, but everybody was on side of this is something that the federal government must do. It was quite remarkable, actually, how quickly we went to very basic values in our society of like, okay, when we're in trouble, this is what the federal government should do. So everybody was on side there. So the result is we have a massive deficit. Yes, we do. So for the Conservatives to go out now and say, okay, it's too big and it's causing inflation, what would you have done differently? Are you having some second thoughts here? So they don't stick around on that point too long. And they do talk about, okay, how to manage it going forward. And so do the Liberals, actually. I mean, everybody's talking about when is the best time to start withdrawing the support. I mean, the support is already being slowly withdrawn and replaced by more sustainable financing over the long term. But there is a debate to be had about how fast that has to happen to keep the deficit under control. The fear is that interest rates will start going up and that, things will become more expensive for borrowers, the government and individuals, and that will really put the boots to us if we haven't fully recovered at that point.
And especially as you've been reporting around the GDP too, each of the sectors, right? Just when we think that one has recovered, we don't know what's around the corner, if there will be further lockdowns. All of this still feels like uneven ground to really stake your claim on what you want to do.
Yeah, it's true. The Prime Minister, Liberal leader Justin Trudeau, talks a lot about coming roaring back. And in fact, all the parties are kind of assuming that we have a strong rebound. We've had a bumpy rebound. Some reports are super strong. We had another good jobs report just last week, but it is back and forth, right? It's all over the place. We are just kind of lurching through this. And the economy contracted in the most recent GDP report. That just took everybody by surprise. It certainly doesn't spell roaring back. It could still happen, or more likely, not roaring back, but coming back a little bit more slowly.
Drips and drabs, yep.
Yes, exactly. I think there is, at the base of it, there's still quite a lot of things in the economy that we have to grapple with left over from the pandemic. There are still people that are afraid to spend on some things, on travel, on going out. There are still quite a few people working from home. There are still quite a few people unemployed. There are pockets of weakness here and there that have just not been able to recover. Others, no problem at all, right? They're right back there. And so we see a very bumpy, kind of uneven recovery happening. And it's hard for a political party to actually say, okay, this is what's going to happen and here's how we're going to handle it when it's so bumpy like this.
Heather, thank you so much for making sense of all of this for us. I hope it helps people at the ballot box.
My pleasure.
And that is Heather Scoffield, the Toronto Star's Ottawa bureau chief and economics columnist. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm your host, Adrian Chung. Our This Matters team is me, Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bachnick, Raju Mudar, Saba Aitazaz, and Sean Pattenden. Our music is by So Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattenden. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us your comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.